So, Marisa, I will start with what is async first company is. Is it different than the remote, which we all know about?
Yes, absolutely. So you can be remote without being async first. And so with remote work, what that is it means you're giving agency to the individual. So the individual is deciding where, when, and how they work. And that might mean the individual goes into an office or a co working space, or they might do it from home. They get to choose, though. It's not the company choosing. Now, when it comes to async first means that instead of defaulting to synchronous activities like meetings or being instantly available in Slack, they're defaulting to async activities, activities that don't require you to be online and, doing something at the same time in the same place as some other person. And one thing to note there is that place can mean like physical place, it can mean like a Zoom call, or it can even mean something like Slack or a Google Doc. If you're requiring the person to instantly respond, that is synchronous.
Okay, so you talked about meetings. In this async first, do you have any kind of recommendation or anything to make these async meetings successful?
Right. So when it comes to async first, you start from the idea of what do synchronous activities benefit the most. And in this case, it means speed and connection. So when something is very urgent, you want to hop on a call, you want to get it done right away, and synchronous activities are amazing for that. And then when it comes to relationship building, so like if I'm trying to, build a relationship with my coworker and learn more about them and become closer to them, synchronous activities is great because you're building experiences together. Everything else should kind of default to async. And that's kind of how we think about when do we decide to have a meeting versus when do we decide to do something async is we think about from the approach of benefits. Is the primary thing that we're going after speed? Is the primary thing we're going after relationship building? If not, then most likely we should start with an async activity
Okay.
first.
Yeah, last week I met somebody from Coinbase, the company Coinbase, and he told me, which
Mhm.
is very interesting, and I think it's very effective too. He says there are meetings are optional. So if you want to have a meeting, you'll write a doc and send it to everybody, and the hope is or the promise from every attendee is that they will put their comments on the document. So then the meeting is completely optional whether you want to show up or not, but you must have your comments if you agree or disagree or whatever you want to say. And if it is really important for you, you will show up. Otherwise, they'll just go through the document, read everyone's comment, and that's it. And they'll call it a day or make a decision on that. I thought that was a pretty good and effective way to have meetings also. So they are optional. Meetings are optional.
I think that's a good transition point. If you're coming from a company that is very synchronous, meetings all the time, that's a great transition point to get you moving away. However, it still comes from the perspective of synchronous first, where you're still expecting a meeting to happen no matter what. It's just pushing you more towards a documentation route where hopefully that meeting can be shorter and you already have pre-planned documentation, so it's not just happening on the fly. So it tends to be a better use of your time, but it's still taking more of a synchronous first approach.
I want to take a hypothetical case. Say, running a company, which is a very traditional company. Everybody used to go to office, have meetings, and make decisions and all that. And now I want to move to this async first. And what
Mhm.
all I should do in my company, like should I change what processes or policies or culturally, what things I can change to make sure that I am successful in this async first phenomena?
Yeah, there's honestly a lot I can say there. We could talk about this all day. But the first place that I recommend people start is setting clear priorities and setting clear expectations. Because without those, if you attempt to take an async first approach to work, it's not going to work because people don't understand what they should be working on and they don't have people available to ask and they don't know what the expectations are. So they're going to default to synchronous. If, say, like their manager sends them a message, they're going to instantly instantly respond to it because they don't know that that expectation is there, that they don't have to, that they can do their deep work first and then respond within a certain period of time. So that would be where I would start. And then again, focus on the benefits of which approach you should take. So if it is focused on speed or relationship building, use a synchronous activity. Like, great, you know that's what benefits it. But if it doesn't, maybe question like, oh, maybe I can do this asynchronously, and maybe I can try to share this in a doc that someone can review in their own time. So just experiment because it's going to take some getting used to too. It's a very new way of working and it requires unlearning things that we've been doing for a very long time. So some of us have been, working for decades in office and they have deeply ingrained habits that require reversal. And so just remember it takes time.
True, true. And I remember seeing your tweet about the setting up a clear priority and expectation, and that
Yep.
brings a lot of responsibility on the management because these things should be very well defined.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of work they have to do to have a very clear priority, what is the priority and the expectation from everybody. So I was just wondering, do you recommend? I know you have a business where people can hire you, you can come in a company and tell them what all they can do. But I was just wondering if you have a quick checklist, at least, which I can go through, or if anybody is listening to this podcast, they can go through the checklist and say, okay, these are the things we must do before we get on this bandwagon of async first. So two things I understand, management, clear priorities, expectations. What other anything else you see?
Yes, so I created my own style of async first because I've been working with companies. I've been working remotely myself since 2015, and then I started my company in 2018 to help other companies go remote. And so I created the Workforward approach, and it has 8 principles. We're not going to have time to dive into it, but it's things like changing how you communicate. So communicating more upfront. So what this means is that you're working ahead in order to anticipate work. An example of this would be an if then response. So someone says, hey, I don't know how to do this. Like, where do I go to find this? Or I'm hitting a bug. Like, these are common things you're most likely going to get a message about. And instead of just saying, try this, you're going to say, try this. If it doesn't work, then try this next. That way, they at least have 2 steps where you're offline, you're asleep because they're in another time zone. They can do more steps while you're asleep instead of just trying one thing, getting stuck, and then not being able to move forward. So definitely check out. I have an article. I believe it's called the Work Forward Approach on my blog. Check it out. There's 8 principles there that will set you up for success in leading an async first team.
You have to make sure that the documentation is in place. Specifically, I'm talking about from a developer side or from the engineering point of view. I think that's one of the most important cultural change a company has to have this a successful async first, where we have very good habit of documenting about the system, about everything, right? Functional spec on user guide and things like that, so people are not stuck. Otherwise, if people are working on the other corner of the world, like it happens with me yesterday, there was a bug which we created here in US, and 6 7 people were stuck in India because they were waiting for us to get up and fix it, and we wasted a lot of time in.
Yes, that's where a lot of companies end up getting stuck because they approach their work from a very strict recipe perspective. So, recipe meaning like, oh, this is step 1, then I do step 2, then I do step 3. When you switch to async first, it requires you to switch from that mentality to more of a parallel point. So, like, if I get stuck here, I'm jumping to this, to jumping to this, to jumping to this. So, no one ever is just feeling like, oh, I'm completely stuck. I have nowhere to go. I have no resources to look at, like you were talking about with documentation. So it requires a mindset shift in how you work. But if you get that mindset shift down, what happens is that you end up working faster because you're working 24/7 hours a day, and then you're also working in parallel. So things are happening all of the time. So, yes, it takes some time to get used to, and it requires some effort along with like documentation and new ways of work, but it can lead to a very effective outcome.
Okay, cool. What I noticed another thing is we went, in fact, the whole world went remote. and we started working, and most of the companies worked fine. And I believe because we already had the relationship built with our teammates, we knew each other, there was a trust, so it was easy to continue working on remotely. But now I am seeing a lot of new hires are coming in who have never seen each other, right? Never met me in
Mm.
person. And we are continuously hiring now more globally than before. So I'm wondering, in this environment, do you have any tips for people to how you set up the culture of the company now when everybody's remote and not meeting each other or seeing each other?
Yes, there's a lot to this. So, one is it's important to know that it is possible to have deep and meaningful connections to people that you haven't ever seen in person before. Like some of my closest coworkers are people from all around the world that I knew virtually. I knew from remote work. So first, it's important to know it's possible. Second, I hear a lot from people like they miss serendipity from
Right.
in-person work where they would meet at the coffee station and they would chat and some new idea would form. And one of the things that I like to mention is that that wasn't true serendipity, right? So like there was all this structure in place in order for that moment to happen. People were in the same location at the same time, and then they met at this coffee shop. So, in order for this moment to happen remotely, you have to create some of that structure. And so that requires a couple of things. So that might mean setting up a regular coffee hours, virtual coffee hours. It might mean setting up lightning talks where people talk about different things that they're interested in. It might mean setting up Slack channels for different interests. It just means setting up places where people can come together with the expectation of building those bonds, building those relationships. And the second point of it is permission, because a lot of people working remotely believe that they have to be available all the time. They have to be working all the time in order for their boss not to see them as slacking or taking advantage of the situation. So you also have to give them permission to form these bonds, to do like non-work communication where they're talking about that TV show, where they're talking about their dogs, where they're, just connecting on a personal level. So the company has to be very explicit or else the individual is going to think, "Hey, they're going to think I'm slacking, so I cannot build this relationship." So that's important to keep in mind. Another thing to remember is to utilize synchronous activities for what they're important for, which one of them was relationship building. And as soon as you cut out meetings and synchronous activities for things that don't have to do with speed and relationship building, then they can become solely focused on those things. So if they're solely focused on relationship building instead of information sharing or brainstorming or whatever the things that you can do asynchronously, and they become more pure and about that. So that's really great. And then also, in person retreats is something that remote companies from pre pandemic have been advocating for forever, where everybody meets up in one city and it's not about their work. It's not about, doing any kind of work activity. It's about creating new experiences together, going to dinner together, going to see shows and activities in this brand new city that they're all in together, and building those bonds. So that's another thing to keep in mind is that in-person retreats are great for that.